Okay. Hello, everybody.
Hi. Howdy.
So everybody see
Hello.
Oli there and
Yes.
can hear
Yes.
Hmm.
me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All
Yep.
right. So big news this week. Finally, the true morphological identity of the Denisovans gets revealed by Dr. Chomai Fu, the IVPP Institute in China's leading, I believe, paleontological geneticist, who was trained by Svante Pabo and David Reich, announced that after 15 years, we know the first Denisovan skull. So we have uh, both mitochondrial DNA and protein analysis that proves that the skull found at Harbin in 1933 by a Chinese worker has been found to contain both of these materials, proving that it is a Denisovan. So
Mhm.
the this was the first paper in 2010 announcing the discovery of the Denisovan genome in a pinky bone from the Denisova cave in Siberia. They were totally surprised. They thought it was just going to be another little piece of Neanderthal bone, but it turned out to reveal an entirely new species that they named Denisovan and did not give a scientific nomenclature to it. So they didn't do Homo Denisovans kind of routine. They just named it Denisovans, and we'll talk a little more about that. They also found a tooth, which also carried the mitochondrial genome as well. So that was the announcement 15 years ago. The problem, of course, is we didn't have a skeleton. So we didn't have no idea what they looked like. And that's been the issue. But importantly, the Denisovans were the first species, hominin species, discovered just by DNA, not by skeletal remains. Um, and the morphology, the skeletal shape of these guys remained unknown, basically. And there was no direct DNA evidence linked to the morphology in present day China. Although we now know from later studies that there are at least two separate Denisovan genetic lineages. In fact, there may be four, but two for sure. Um, and the one that's dated, the later one is more closely related to the individuals from Denisova than the other one. Um, so the what we have had is molecular DNA evidence from teeth, from fragmentary bones, from cave dirt in Denisova. Uh, Cave. We also have a mandible, a rib, and cave dirt sediment DNA from Bashaya Cave in the Tibetan Plateau. We just within the last several months, the discovery of the mandible from a fisherman who caught this mandible in his net in the Penghu Channel in Taiwan. So
Hmm.
it's clear. And then we have a tooth from Laos, the town known how Two Tooth, that's been attributed to this based on its shape, because these teeth that are attributed to Denisovans are colossally large. Okay,
Hmm.
almost as big as Paranthropus. So the
Wow.
suspicion is that these guys were big compared to, and the idea has been since the discovery in 210 of the genome that they are a sister group that broke off from the Neanderthals. So back 700,000 years ago, Neanderthals broke off from Homo sapiens, and then about a couple 100,000 years later, Denisovans break off from Neanderthals. At least that's the current model. That these are the major morphological evidence for Denisovans. This is the ex-woman original pinky finger bone that was found in Denisova Cave. It was actually cut in half by Svante Pablo's group at Leipzig. And this part was sent to a UC Berkeley researcher and has disappeared. Okay, nobody knows where it is. And this part was used to identify the nuclear DNA of Denisovans by Pablo's group in Leipzig. And I believe it was actually destroyed in the process of getting the DNA. They've also found these massive three-rooted teeth from Denisova Cave, but they've also gotten DNA from there, about 5 of these, I believe. They then discovered this 1-inch bone in the Denisova Cave, and this is Denisova 11, nicknamed Denny, because it turns out she's like a 9-year-old hybrid. Mother was Neanderthal, father was Denisovan, okay, from the DNA in this bone. They then discover the Tibetan mandible with 2 teeth. And then just within the last couple of months, they find a fisherman netted this mandible in the Taiwan Straits, basically. And I believe protein analysis identified this as Denisovan as well. So just quick, ancient DNA is actually either mitochondrial DNA or nuclear DNA. Nuclear is pretty massive in terms of the amount of data we can get. But mitochondrial DNA, which sits in mitochondrial in your cell, and there are hundreds of thousands of these in every cell. Okay, they're the powerhouse of cells in the human body. So your chances of finding mitochondrial DNA are massively larger than it is to find nuclear DNA, where you only have 2 copies in every cell. So the goal is always to find nuclear, but lots of the data is mitochondrial. And then proteins are what are produced by DNA. And there are more of those. And the important point is that they last tremendously longer than ancient DNA. They go into the millions of years, and I believe they actually have some from dinosaurs, okay? But these are the 2 methods now that are being used to discover who belonged to whom.
Charlie, I hate to interrupt, but where is the Denisova cave at?
It's in northern Siberia. Okay, sort of the middle of Russia. Okay, very, very cold. The reason they discovered them there is that this cave is intensely cold, and that really helps preservation of DNA. Okay, which is why it's been much more difficult to find it in Africa, where it's much hotter, as an example. But so here actually is Europe, Russia, China, and the Indonesian peninsula. And this is approximately where Denisova is on this map. And that's where they found the first lineage of Denisovans. The next group they found was D2 in Indonesia, and then a much smaller subset of D1, I believe, in New Guinea. Okay, so they've got at least, and there was another article that said there's a 4th one, which is so different that it could be its own species, but it's also linked to the Denisovan group. So these guys moved in a massive region. And so it's been stunning that we haven't been able to find a skeleton. We've only been finding teeth and little tidbits, mostly from the Denisova cave. But they got isolated enough at times to produce a separate lineage, genetic lineage that was slightly different from the original Denisova cave group. So This is the Harbin Bridge. It's named after this bridge that was built by the Japanese when they entered China in 1932. And they began rebuilding this bridge. And they conscripted Chinese laborers to build the bridge. And one of those Chinese laborers, somewhere on this shore or that shore, ended up finding a skull. Okay. And that's what became the famously known Harbin Skull. So this story is amazing because this worker found it in 1933. And he was collaborating with the Japanese on the construction of the bridge, and he hid it from his bosses and kept it in his farm well for the rest of his life, 85 years, until on his deathbed, he tells his grandson that he buried this skull. And in 2018, the grandson recovered the fossil, donated it to the Hebei University Paleontology Group, to Dr. Xiang Ji, who welcomed it as a treasure as it had survived the Japanese invasion, a civil war, the communist dictatorship, Mao's Cultural Revolution, and rampant fossil trafficking in China. Although Ji actually suspects that the grandson may have discovered the artifact himself but failed to report it. The problem originally was that they didn't know where it had actually come from specifically or how old it was. But they looked at mud that was stuck in its nose and identified it with the same sediments beneath the Harbin Bridge. So they now know where it was, and via uranium dating, they dated it to approximately 146,000 years ago. So
Charlie?
Yes.
So what is the time frame? When do we believe that the earliest Denisovans arose?
I'll come to that. Okay. Approximately, and next time I may try to cover a new study has done a really thorough dating of all 25 sediment layers in Denisova Cave. And it starts out, I believe, approximately around 300 to 200,000 years ago, going down, going up to the top layer where Homo sapiens stuff shows up at around 40K. So this is sort of in the middle, okay? But among the older sediments in Denisova Cave, comparatively. Okay. For comparison, these are some classical Neanderthal skulls, just to compare the features. So this is the Gibraltar 1 Forbes quarry found by a British lieutenant who was stationed there in 1848. That's not the Neander Valley Neanderthal that was first discovered in 1856, which is considered the holotype for Neanderthals. But this guy was not recognized until 1865 as being a Neanderthal. This is the La Chapelle Neanderthal that Boole did his first monograph of, and conceived of him as a kind of dumb, bad-looking kind of caveman type. And this guy, the original skeleton, in fact, was highly arthritic, looked like an old man, and is called the Old Man. And this is a much later Neanderthal skull from Amud, Israel, that is one of the last Neanderthals, and who has slightly different, more graceful style features than these guys. But these guys all have sort of some of the classic Neanderthal features: a low, long skull, wide, large sockets, because they're about 20% bigger than modern humans, because they were trying to absorb more light in Northern Europe, where the light is different than bright Africa. There's a very large supraorbital torus, the brow ridge, There's an extremely large nose. They thought for pulling in more air in Arctic cold conditions. And the trait that highlights Neanderthals is this cheek region that sort of juts out. It's like being pulled out compared to ours. Okay, you can see it here as well. Although this part is actually missing in this guy.
Yeah, it is.
And no projecting chin. Only modern humans have that. Okay, so those are the features that typify Neanderthals, the original group from which Denisovans separated, we believe.
Charlie, it looks
Yes.
like Amud or Amud or whatever it is, the last one, does seem to have much more of a chin, or is that just an artifact of the
No,
angle?
actually, some of the Israeli Neanderthals do have an incipient chin. Okay. They actually think there's a big question about whether these guys are hybrids.
Oh,
Okay, that
okay.
Homo sapiens may have gotten in here. Okay. There certainly was introgression going on down there.
Okay.
In fact, it is considered one of the areas where the introgression around 50K, 40K actually happened. So
Yeah.
that's Neanderthal. And this is the Harbin skull. I've always thought it's an amazingly beautiful skull. It was named in 2021 as Homo longi after the longi area where Harbin is located. The river is called the Dragon River, which is why he got nicknamed Dragon Man. But this is the first Denisovan skull that's been identified by mitochondrial DNA and protein analysis, which we'll review. So look at those eyebrows, okay? So this is actually the single best preserved skull in hominin history. Preserving it in that well apparently helped preserve this guy, and why he was so well preserved is unknown. But this is a different view, and you can see both the large orbits, the huge, massive supraorbital torus with the globula in here indented, the large nose, and one tooth, okay, which is hugely important, it turns out. So that tooth. Okay. And here's a side view. Yes.
Yeah, Charlie, can you describe again the relationship? I mean, who comes first? Denisovans? Are they on the same branch with Neanderthal or what?
So originally Homo sapiens from Africa. We do not know when and where they split off from the Neanderthals, split off from the original African Homo sapiens branch. So Neanderthals came first around, they think, 700 to 500,000 years ago. But we don't know where they split off. Then Neanderthals were generally in the European area, and somewhere a little further east, Denisovans split off from Neanderthal. So Homo sapiens first, Neanderthal second, Denisovans third. Okay. This is a side view of the skull. And here's some different views, both sides, the top, bottom, the one tooth, and the second most characteristic thing about Neanderthal is the supraneac ossa. That's the official name for what in Neanderthals is a pretty big dip right here. It's actually a kind of hole that may have served as a muscle attachment, etc. But these guys had a much more shallow fossa. Okay, that's another of their characteristics.
Charlie,
Yes.
when we talk about the splits of the Homo sapiens, etc., I mean, but we didn't have Homo sapien as identifiable
No,
species until about, what, 300,000 years ago or so. So it was
right.
an archaic version, or whatever you want to say, that was split off, correct?
Right. So the oldest Homo sapiens skull that we have um, is from Jebel Hood in Morocco, dated to about 315,000 years ago. And the face looks like a modern Homo sapiens, but the skull looks like more like this, lower and longer, like a Neanderthal. So it hadn't come into its modern features. The Herto skull, which I'll show you later, is dated to around 160K, and they consider the classic features of late Homo sapiens, even though it was not as globular as the Homo sapiens skulls from 30,000 years ago are. So our final form didn't happen until probably after 40K. Okay, so but most now, the earliest one we have found, amazingly, in northern Africa, not in East Africa, is Jebel Hood. Okay, here is a endocast digital reconstruction of the brain of Harbin. Okay, this is what it looks like in terms of their reconstruction. What I find most interesting, okay, is look at this frontal hole,
Yeah.
okay, compared to us. This is modern Homo sapiens. Now remember, oh, I haven't said this, but this brain is 1420 cc's, bigger. Our average modern human is 1350. So this brain was huge. Okay. It compares to the classic Neanderthal, which was around 1450, about 100 cc's bigger than us at 40,000 years ago. But this skull is right in the middle of the Neanderthal range, being a relatively big brain. But still, it looks to me, from a neuropsych perspective, is that there's a lot of the orbital frontal not there. And today, this region, if you chop it off, you basically become a psychopath. Okay, that's where your social control mechanisms all live, etc. But that's modern humans. Okay, today we don't know where those functions were located back in this period, 140,000 years ago. So I'm not going to include anything about their behavioral capabilities because clearly they were around for a very long time. And I'm sure that being nice to your fellow Denisovans was a survival advantage. So I suspect they had relatively good social control in relation to other Denisovans. Okay, but it's curious, this finding, basically. Okay. And that's a reconstruction, all right? An estimate, basically. Here's
Goodness.
this is a beautiful skull. I mean, just I've always been in awe. The other one that I love the most is the Broken Hill skull in Africa, which interestingly we'll make some comments about. Okay. So what we've got here is a low, long cranial vault, wide, flat, low face, sort of like ours, square, large eyeballs, a massive brow ridge, basically. And the cheekbones tend to be more like us and rather less than like Neanderthals, interestingly. The tooth sockets are very thick. And remember, these guys have massively large molars, bigger than ours, Neanderthals, almost as large as Paranthropus, the largest that we know of. Okay, so those are the major features of this guy. And I reviewed this back in 2019 when it came out. This was like 6 years ago. A group in Israel realized that when they had the entire Denisovan genome, the nuclear DNA, if you have that, you also have all of the methylation data that sits around DNA. And remember, the methyl chemicals are produced by experience as opposed to genetics. And they're chemical creatures that activate the genes or shut them down in function. Okay? Catch that difference. Which then means you could potentially use the methylation data to give you some idea as to if you know which genes control which bone growth, you could begin identifying what the skeletal features of the genome looked like, which is what they did in this paper in 2019. They predicted what the Denisovan skeleton should look like based on methylation data. And here's their idea of what Denisovans probably look like compared to us, taller, thinner, etc., and Neanderthals. Both of these groups shorter, more kind of stockier football kind of guys. And note that the skull for the Denisovans, they thought in this study, looked heavier and bigger than even Neanderthal. Okay, so this was an interesting little study based on methylation data. So here is what the modern humans look like. Here's what they think the Denisovans should look like, basically broader skull, etc., compared to Neanderthals. They then do last year another paper looking only at the crania, the skull, and predicting what you should find and which skulls in the Chinese record are the best match for who should be a Denisovan. And guess who they picked? They picked Harbin, okay? And they think next is Dolly, and next is Broken Hill in Africa, interestingly enough. Okay, we'll come back to that.
Say, Charlie,
yes.
can you show quickly that slide of the skulls again?
This one?
Yes.
Denisovan.
Okay. Thank you.
So, a little broader. They didn't necessarily identify how thick the eyebrows would be, although a little thicker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Charlie, can you go over relationship? The Neanderthals came first, then the Denisovans, then us, or how did that work in the time scale?
The timeline, once again, is us at 700.
You're fading out.
Hold on. Getting carrying the battery.
Oh,
We lost Charlie.
Yeah,
What?
Charlie, we lost your voice.
Okay, let me change batteries. Hold on.
all right.
At 700K, I think you're talking about a common ancestor, not about Homo sapiens.
No, I believe the range that's typically given for the separation of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is 700 to 500K. I'm pretty sure of that
Uh,
number.
I
Can you
thought
hear
that,
me? Can you hear
yeah,
me? Okay.
yes. But I
Uh,
thought the 700 to 500 K was uh, supposing that the groups that were ancestral to Neanderthal left Africa or distanced themselves from the ones that did not leave Africa and that eventually give rise to us. Whereas the ones who moved through the Middle East and into Europe were separated. But at first, that was uh, theorized to be Homo heidelbergensis. I think it's gotten to be a more complicated picture
yeah, yeah.
over the last few
So
years.
actually, in my reading in the last 6 months, Chris Stringer, who we'll talk about, is now talking about 1 million years as opposed to 700K
Okay.
for being the range for the separation of the two.
Mhm.
And that are the last common ancestor of all of these guys is even older than that.
Okay.
Okay, so it's a ongoing story, basically. Okay.
So we don't know which is older, humans or Neanderthals?
No, we do.
We do.
Everybody believes Homo sapiens is the first guy.
First guy in Neanderthals,
They
then the
they they
Denisovans.
they start out in Africa,
Mhm.
and there's the possibility that in Africa, Neanderthal separated from Homo sapiens. It also could have happened in the Middle East somewhere. Okay, that's another region that's often talked about. They simply don't know. Okay,
And we
and
don't
if you
know
want,
about the third group.
and the third group almost certainly happened in somewhere in the western side of Asia
Mhm.
is the likelihood. Although we've now got Denisovan data from Siberia, from China, from Indonesia, but everybody thinks it's in here probably that the separation took place. But first Homo sapiens, then Neanderthals, then Denisovans is the timing of this group.
Charlie, are you saying that the common ancestor to Neanderthals and us, that as you're putting it, Homo sapien is the same, would look the same as we are? That the
No,
skull would be exactly the same as us?
No,
no.
no, we don't know what that skull looks like because we've never found. I mean, almost certainly, the first guy that leaves Africa is Homo erectus.
Right.
And that skull is probably the original skull that the last common ancestor probably looked like in some way. There is then the group called Heidelbergensis,
Mhm.
which is typically dated from around 800 to 600,000 years ago. And for a long time, we were talking that Heidelbergensis was the last common ancestor of both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. But in the last 5 years, there's been a shift in thinking that Homo neander, I'm sorry, Heidelbergensis ended up in Europe and became um, Neanderthal. So that
Yeah.
the Cima de los Huesos, early Neanderthals of 400K were originally thought of as Heidelbergensis, and then they were reclassified as early Neanderthals. And us Homo sapiens in Africa uh, ended up via some kind of pan-African multi-group connectivity over multiple years and generations, eventually became Homo sapiens, not via Heidelbergensis. For a
Charlie,
lot, go ahead.
So what about the ones that the Spanish call antecessor?
For a while, he was in contention as a possible ancestor, but a major phylogenetic study proved that he's a sister group,
Okay.
not a direct ancestor. We'll talk about him a little bit later. So in this,
One quick thing, Charlie.
yes,
What was Peking man again?
he's
was
Homo
erectus.
erectus.
Oh, that's not hapless, right?
No,
Oh,
no,
okay.
no, but well, we'll talk
It was
about that.
erectus.
All right.
Yeah. So the 2024 study, the Israelis using again methylation predicted that Harbin was the most likely skull to be Denisovan based on the methylation data in the Denisovan genome. Okay, they used these skulls in this comparative study. They included Cobway, the Broken Hill skull. And part of the controversy was about 5 years ago, they redated him from being 600,000 years old compared to the Bodo skull to only being 315K. So he could no longer be ancestral to Homo sapiens. He was considered the best example of Heidelbergensis in Africa. So they believe that's now been disproved. He's 300K. He's identical in age to Jebel Hood in Morocco, who was our ancestor, okay, or one of possible ancestors. So they did an analysis basically using the mitochondria. Let me get this straight. The methylation data and predicted that Harbin and possibly Dolly, we'll show you these guys, are the most likely candidates for being Denisovans. And with the new study, they were proven right. Okay. But again, Harbin, Dolly, and Way in Africa, they somehow thought could potentially be Denisovan. Now remember Cima de los Huesos in Spain, the pit of the bones is where they found the 415K pre-Neanderthal, okay? But the original DNA study of that group showed that the mitochondrial DNA in that Neanderthal group was Denisovan. Okay. And they still haven't totally adequately explained, to me at least, how that possibly got to be Denisovan. There was probably an ancestor that had been common to both Neanderthals and Denisovans that ended up being part of the gene that ended up in Cima de los Huesos. The nuclear DNA of Huesos is Neanderthal. Okay, so this gets complicated, but Cobway is part of the prediction here. Okay, in 2000,
we have the full nuclear genome of Denisova.
Yes, in the original 2010 study, they pumped out both the mitochondrial and the nuclear. Okay, so the nuclear is much longer, much more data revealing than the mitochondrial DNA, which is only 16,000 variants in every mitochondria, whereas the nuclear is like 3 billion variants. Okay, so you always want to find nuclear if you can.
So isn't it surprising that you would find mitochondrial DNA, but not nuclear DNA in the?
No, the reason for that again is in every cell in our body, you've actually got 100 to 10,000 mitochondria compared to 2 nuclear, which means that if you find ancient DNA, you are much more likely to find mitochondria because there was vastly more of it.
But the the DNA that they used in Spain was not the total nuclear DNA,
No, they found both eventually.
but
Yeah, the original study was mitochondrial. The follow-up study was the nuclear DNA.
but they did not find any match between the nuclear DNA in Spain and the Denisova, where they did find the mitochondrial DNA in the Spain.
Right. So the mitochondrial turned out to be Denisovan. The nuclear tended to be definitely Neanderthal.
And that's not surprising.
Well, you could have it could have been a hybrid
Mm.
with a mother who was more Denisovan than the father.
Right.
Okay, so that's the possibility.
Charlie, I got the thing about changing the dating of Kabwe 1, but what group is Kabwe now classed as?
It's just considered now one of the dozen or so skulls that are considered kind of that ancient, that archaic Homo sapiens group.
Okay.
Okay, just a kind of general dump everything into that category.
Okay.
Routine. Okay, so in 2021, Dr. Nee, Dr. G, and Chris Stringer announced to the world the coming out of the Harbin skull for the first time, a completely preserved fossil cranium found in the Harbin area with a brain capacity of 1420, huge, and the upper jaw, they believed, looked like a match for the mandible from Tibet that was Denisovan, but they didn't actually think this skull in this study was Denisovan. They thought it was a new species. Okay. And here's Dr. Nee, Chris Stringer, and Dr. G, who was the one the grandson gave this skull to him. Okay, that's the history. And these guys published. And I follow Chris assiduously because I think he's one of the great. I think I once told you that his PhD dissertation in the 1970s, he took a VW bus all over Europe and Asia and basically measured every skull that was currently available and proved that Neanderthals were definitively a separate group from Homo sapiens from morphological perspective. Okay, they didn't have DNA at that point. So the uranium dated it to 146,000 years ago, although the range is from like 130 to 300K. So it could actually be older. And it differs clearly from the other skulls that we know of. The features we've talked about just previously. And it's clearly a mosaic of some older features and some newer features, basically. And there's no upper parietal expansion like there is in modern humans. They think the parietal lobe was the last to expand in us. And it doesn't have what's called the embalm, the sort of football-like shape to the Neanderthal skull. It's a little different than that, although long. The face is clearly a little more like ours in some way. And they compare it to the Dali skull, the Denisovans skull, and the Hulong Dong cranium are the grouping that comes out looking the most. And then there's the two newest, which we'll talk about in a bit. Okay, so here's Peking man, Homo erectus, the classic Zuhudunian region right outside of Beijing. Long skull, big eyebrows. although the brain size is only around typically about 100,000 cc's, okay, about 2/3 of ours. The half Maba skull, the Denisovans skull, the Dolly skull, and the Harbin skull. My next bet is Dolly. Okay, it's going to be named Denisovan. We'll see. So the other thing they noted was the molar, the M2 molar, which is huge, and it matched the size of the molars they found at Denisova. And these guys are big, 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 basically. Okay. They then do a phylogenetic study comparing most of the major skulls that they thought were important, 55 different fossils, basically, and came out with 5 groupings based. So phylogenetic analysis is a statistical technique where you measure whatever you're looking at, let's say a skull, and identify the breadth, the height, the thickness, the eyebrows, the mouth size, the nose size, etc.
And she does do pictures, but
and then you put it into a statistical program, analyzes them all, and sees which characteristics
Rocco plays a big role here, you know.
Someone is talking out loud back there. Mute, please. Thank you. And this is what they found, that there's a Homo erectus group, that there was a kind of Heidelbergensis group, and then a Neanderthal group, and then a Harbin group, and then a modern human group. Remember, there were no Denisovan skulls that had been identified at this point. So that's why you don't find a Denisovan group, except interestingly, it was Harbin that popped out as the other group in here, okay? So it's pretty much what we would have expected. And Harbin showed up as a separate group, a kind of sister group to Homo sapiens, is the way they put it and they thought that Harbin and the Zia mandible matched up, basically. They also, in this study, came up that looking at all the range variation in these skulls, that the best model was some kind of what they described as a shuttle dispersal going from Africa to China and possibly back. Okay, so again, Bayes' hypothesis that maybe there was some Asian blowback to Africa. Okay, and this is a more intense version of their phylogeny, and I'm going to split this up here into this vision. So there was a Neanderthal. So the Almut skull, the La Chapelle skull all fit in here with the Neanderthals. The next group was Antecessor, interestingly, fit here, as well as Jinushang, Guangdong, Dali, the Xia, and Harbin all fit in to this sister group. And then the human group with Ehud, Awasi, Cro-Magnon, etc., all fit in nicely. So it was a nice split with this group being a separate group that at this point they didn't know this is the Denisovan group potentially. Okay. Okay. And one of the things they think is the massivity of this skull. They think is probably related to the fact that the Harbin region in winter gets down to 16 centigrade below zero. This is an incredibly cold region, just like Denisova, okay? So they think that may have pushed some of the morphological characteristics that we find, that there was a big brain, a big skull, plus probably a big football kind of body as well as a physical adaptation to the cold conditions.
Charlie,
Yes.
In this, it sounds like the assumption is that the climate at that point was very similar to the way it is now.
All right.
Yes. At least the original speciation climate, okay? Which, because there have been glacial periods, interglacial periods,
Right.
we're in an interglacial now. Okay, so it's warmer now than it used to be. So they ended up naming this using a taxonomical nomenclature of Homo longi is the name they gave it. And this is important because they actually identified, characterized, and then scientifically named this skull, which gives it some taxonomical privilege, okay? Those who name first get the name forever. Okay, we'll come back to that. And longi is the name of the river region where it was found, the Harbin area. In Chinese is Longi Dragon River, and why he's also called Dragon Man. Okay, so and identified as a sister group to Homo sapiens. Interestingly, Chris Stringer, the one of the three authors, thought Homo daliensis would have been a better name than longi. Okay, because he thinks it's very related to the Dali skull. And he thinks that the Harbin is related to the usual suspects here, Dali, Jinsan, and Shia. And Ricardo Saiz is a Spanish paleontologist who I follow. And he just comments again that the usual suspects, he believes are possibly Denisovan. And he was right. Okay. So here is Harbin, and here is Dali. Again, look at those eyebrows. Okay. Large nose, similar orbits, etc. I'm betting this is the next guy to be identified. I will have more to say about that in a bit. Sister group of Homo sapiens. There have been a bunch of reconstructions of what they think Dragon Man looked like. All of these are pure speculation, in my opinion. Okay. And of course, Gurchi is among the best in terms of trying to use forensic reconstruction techniques as to what they may have looked like. But here, obviously, this face, as an example, looks much more Chinese than this face, okay? But again, pure speculation, okay? Except a little bit more scientific in terms of muscle placements, etc., from what you find on attachments on the bone, etc. Now, the first study that got published by Dr. Fu highlights the importance of plaque, okay? This is what your dentist sees when they open your mouth, or my mouth, and they find some nice shiny dentin and some plaque that builds up around your teeth. 80% of dental plaque calculus is mineral, made up of calcium phosphate crystals. 15% or so is organic. And there are about 200 million cells per milligram in the plaque. And they contain primarily bacterial material that's been absorbed, including archaea, yeast, but also proteins, lipids, and cells that came out of your mouth that contain DNA. Okay. So DNA is potentially captured by plaque. So it acts as a protective shield, encasing and preserving DNA, other organic materials within its mineral structure, protecting them from contamination. And historically, we've seen studies that have proven using dental plaque that starch was used before agriculture by us and Neanderthals. That the famous Neanderthal teenager who died of an abscess, they looked at his plaque and found that he'd been eating poplar leaves, which have aspirin in it, and two different mosses that had penicillin in it, proving that Neanderthals had a medicine chest. Okay, they've shown oral microbiome of ancient hominins in plaque, and they have found host DNA in plaque that identified several groups of Native Americans, separating them out. And also you can tell paleoenvironmental information. So plaque is a gold mine, potentially, of information. This is Shomai Hu, who I've been following for a bunch of years since she was a graduate student at Leipzig under Svante Pääbo, who won the Nobel Prize for ancient DNA. She then went on to do her postgraduate work with David Reich at Harvard. So she was trained by the two best ancient DNA specialists in the world and has been at the IBPP Institute in China doing genetic paleontological work for the last 15 years. She was in on the original paper published by these guys identifying the Denisovan genome, okay, the pinky bone material. She is going to go down in paleontological history for these two studies, along, obviously, with her teachers, okay? So she worked on the first DNA of Denisovans, and she has spent years looking at Chinese skulls and other fossils in Chinese museums, looking for Denisovan DNA, okay? And came up empty for 15 years worth of trying until now. She got permission from Dr. G to look at the Harbin skull, and she proved the importance of tooth plaque, basically, because that's where they found mitochondrial DNA, and linked it basically to the mitochondrial DNA that they found in the material at the Denisova cave, basically. So they first tried the petrous bone, which is where they classically find ancient DNA. It's the densest bone in your body surrounding your ear canal region, your acoustical machinery. And they tried 6 different times and found zip. They then tried going into the tooth to see if they could find ancient DNA, and zip, no results. And in the last try, she thought, well, maybe how about if we look at the plaque on top of the tooth? And bingo, they found mitochondrial DNA. All right, so this was an amazing, the amount of different stages of the research they did were incredible in my thinking. So using that tooth, they get mitochondrial DNA dated to 146 from the Harbin skull. It is genetically related to the earlier Denisovans dated to around 190K, as opposed to the later 50K, 60K Denisovans that was found in the Tibet data, the mandible, okay? So much more like the earlier than the later, and probably because
earlier.
It was earlier when they split off from the Neanderthals, basically. Yeah, and again, Harbin may be 300,000 K for all we know. Okay, so the earlier group is what the match came up with, and so this data solves what did the Denisovans look like, although this is only one skull. As I say later, If you try to paint a picture of modern human, what we look like compared using one skull, you would probably be way off. But it's one skull. Hopefully, it is pretty typical. Okay. And historically, it's been considered male because it's so big, but they got no genetic data to infer sex. So we don't actually know for sure. And okay, we said that. So the phylogenetic data shows that the Harbin sits in well with all the molar data from Denisova, basically from the earlier data compared to the younger data. And also, as you can see, related to the mitochondrial data in the Sima de los Huesos, Neanderthals back there, and compared to the Homo sapiens group. So we don't have genetic data from Dali, Jin, Shan, Bulong Dong, et cetera yet. This study also points to the fact that now dental calculus is, I bet every Chinese researcher in Asia is going to be looking at every museum specimen using dental calculus as opposed to digging in for the petrous bone necessarily. We'll see. Okay. And so using dental plaque as a technique, I think is going to help revolutionize some of the next studies, basically. But again, they're also, we need to find nuclear DNA because without nuclear DNA, a case could be made that this individual, like the Sima de los Huesos, is a hybrid with a Denisovan mother. Okay, although none of the researchers believe that's true. Okay. Then study number 2 is when they went in to the petrous bone, they failed finding ancient DNA, but they did find proteins. They in fact found 95 endogenous proteins in the petrous bone material. And they found 3 Denisovan-derived amino acid variants, which clustered with the Denisova 3 molar. The pinky bone, clearly suggesting that the Harbin individual belongs to the Denisovan population. So again, this is the second method for proving that Harbin is definitively a Denisovan. And it connects to the partial mandible from Tibet, the mandible from Penghu, and the protein that they have from the Laos.
Diet for you point up my toenail.
And again,
Hey, Charlie,
yes.
I was curious if you could show us the 3 pictures quickly again at some point of the what they would look like, this fella.
We'll come to it again.
All right.
In just a little bit.
Our insurance.
Okay. Phylogenetic, they also did a phylogenetic study. Oh, here, let's bring in Christopher Bay and Dr. Wu recently published in last year a major study that they looked at the Shu Chang and the Shuji Yao
service
skull parts that they named as Homo juliensis. They added the Penghu mandible as well as all of the Denisovan material into this new Homo species, okay? Lots of people criticize their inclusion of the Denisovans, okay? And these 2 new studies also potentially challenges that, in fact, it may not be a new species, but in fact, they may be Denisovans as well. Okay, but we don't have data yet. But Bay did publish a second study where he tried to group everything, and he grouped Harbin with the usual suspect three, okay, Dolly, etc. He gave a second group the Maba skull as well as the Mada skull from India, the only fossil from India. And then the two massive skulls that have 1700 cc brains that he named Homo juliensis. Okay, so that's in the background. And in Africa, Bodo here and Cobway here also look a little bit like Harbin. Okay, so after failing, Fu took 6 samples from the petrous bone and teeth of the Harbin individual. No sample showed DNA. But from the 2 petrous samples, the ear bone sample, they ended up getting 95 proteins with as many as 19,000 peptides. And this was the largest collection ever found of proteins in any creature on the planet. All right, so this was a massively successful draw, basically. And this is the comparison with the Harbin proteins that they found in terms of the count compared to all the other proteins ever found in other hominids. Okay, so this is a spectacular find just in terms of how much they found, basically 11 times larger than everything else. 4 of these proteins were distinct to the Denisovan lineage. Okay, and the skull matched the Denisovans on 3 of them, and that's enough to confidentially basically say that this is definitely Denisovans. You don't need much in terms of identification. And one of the alleles found in the Harbin individual was already identified in the Zia and Pengu mandibles, the proteins. Okay, so a very good match of this is it was also in the original pinky bone, so pretty clearly Denisovan. Okay, but again, is this a typical Denisovan we're looking at? Still not quite sure. But the other big conclusion they draw, of course, is this adds to the fact that Denisovans were all over the place, okay? From northern Siberia to all the way to the Taiwan Straits, all the way to Papua New Guinea, okay? And remember that the modern Indonesian Homo sapiens, us, in Indonesia, have 2% Neanderthal and 4% Denisovan. Okay, that they've got the most Denisovan genetics of anybody on the planet. And whether it was the same Denisovans in Indonesia is one of the big questions, because there are multiple lineages of Denisovans in Indonesia. Okay.
Say, Charlie.
So, yes.
What percentage do we have of Denisovans? Because I know we're supposed to have about 2% Neanderthal.
You have about 0.05.
0.05.
0.05. And that's what most Asians also do, Native Americans, almost none in Africa. And Europeans tend to have about maybe less than 0.05. Someone did Americans, but I can't remember the exact number, but again, it's in that lower range. So what's been the reaction to all of this? Svante Pääbo says the species Homo longi must therefore be discarded, and we must even stop thinking about species when talking about human evolution. The concept of species is no longer useful when talking about Neanderthals and Denisovans. They are closely related groups that interbred and had fertile children, also with our species. So we prefer to talk about modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. We would simply call them all Homo sapiens. Okay, that was his reaction. John Hawkes still basically is going to continue using the Denisovan name, but he says the fact that they could interbreed with our own species makes them a lineage in our own species along with Neanderthals. I'm pretty confident saying these are all Homo sapiens, so they're pretty much in agreement. Chris Stringer. The work makes it increasingly likely that this is the most complete Denisovan fossil found so far, and that Homo longi is the appropriate species name for this group. Another name, Homo juliensis, was recently coined to include Denisovans by Bay, but not Harbin, so it is unlikely to be appropriate for either group. Our analysis suggests that the most large cranial humans of the past 800,000 years can be classified into one or other of the following groups: Asian Homo erectus, heidelbergensis, Neanderthal, sapiens, and Denisovans longi. Ricardo says, since the priority principle states that the name defined first wins, it seems that Homo longi would be the best candidate to name the Denisovan species. Interestingly, Dr. Nee of the original 2021 paper is still not convinced it is Denisovan. Okay, he thinks it's not enough information yet. Bence Viola, one of the major researchers at Denisova, believes that this is definitely a Denisovan. So here is Harbin. And here's Dolly. Okay. This is Bodo in Africa at 600,000 years ago. This is Kabwe now at 300,000 years ago. This is the Hurto skull, which in 2009, when I started being a docent at the academy, was the definitive modern human from 165K, although not as globular in terms of the back of the skull being round as the 30K versions of us. And this is the new Harbin skull, okay, in comparison. And note, Hurto was more round than any of the other three. These three guys had longer, lower skull, although this is getting a little heftier, okay? And we haven't talked about this guy yet, but Yushian, they found two highly distorted skulls that originally they thought was Homo erectus. We'll be talking about them. And they reconstructed them. This is Harbin, and this is the Hulong Dong partial skull that they have, which is around 275K, which they think also is potentially a Denisovan. We'll see. So is Dolly a Denisovan? Okay. I'm betting that Fu is going to do this next. Okay. That's my bet. Here's the long side of Dolly. And here's Jin Yushap, which is also pretty hefty at 1330 cc's. The eyebrows are not quite as massive, but definitely in that direction. And this is Broken Hill Cowboy. Again, massive brow ridges, big nose, similar kind of long cranium. 1280 dated since
Charlie, where are these three different skulls? Where were they found? This one in Africa?
So China, Dolly, China, Jinusan, Africa, Broken Hill.
Thank you.
Okay. And On impulse last night, I emailed Dr. Fu and congratulated her on these two wonderful studies and all of her prior work trying to find Denisovans. And within an hour, she writes back, "Dear Charlie, whoa, really appreciate your great recognition and support. These mean a lot to me. Really, really thanks. Best, Show May." So I've also sent her another email asking her what next, because I'm going to start in my next part of this talk about a talk that Maria Martignon gave, and at the end of that talk, Johannes Krauss, who was a classmate of Dr. Fu at Leipzig, and he was part of the original discovery of the Denisovans as well, said, hang in there, because we're going to be seeing some interesting studies in the next near period. So I'm betting in the next year, we're going to see a whole bunch of the Chinese skulls be analyzed, both for mitochondrial DNA and for protein analysis. Okay, so that's the massively good news about Neanderthal and I'm sorry, Denisovans. So I also came across a talk by Maria Martignon Torres. She's the head of a Spanish lab. She is primarily a dental specialist. That's her real specialty, but she's been doing a lot of work with the Chinese group. So I think this gives us some new data about the area of Asian paleoarchaeology that we've been talking about. And she starts off by talking about the Cima de los Huesos pre-Neanderthals, dated to 430K, the Homo antecessor, partial face from around 860K, and then the Cima del Elefante, mandible and partial face, that's been dated to 1.4 million years ago. So the suspicion is that somewhere out here, okay, in Western Asia, Homo erectus ended up, and this is pretty close to Dmanisi, where we know that Homo erectus, or something very similar to him, got here at 1.8 million years ago with the smallest brains of any Homo erecti that we know of, in the range of 500 cc's. Okay. So we think Homo erecti headed this way first, but maybe not, because we now have the Xinjiang lithics, stone tools from northern China that are dated to 2.1 million years ago. And the big contention there, of course, is, was that Homo erectus, or was that a pre-Homo erecti that got to China? All right, big debate. But here in Spain, we get these three guys, basically. And because of her dental work, Martignon Torres is possibly more in the continuity Chinese theory group than they are in the Chris Stringer out of Africa group. Okay, so a warning in relation to that. So Homo antecessor are 11 individuals with a partial face that are mostly children and younger individuals. And they basically got 160 specimens in 11 individuals that are the collection that make up Homo antecessor. This is the face of the finding, dated to 860 from Grandolina, level TD6, and that's how they're, this guy is identified. And so Torres is a dental analyst specialist, basically. She really knows her teeth, basically. And the reason this Homo antecessor is so famous is because he's got a flat face, as opposed to a prognatic jutting out face like chimpanzees. And so this was a real surprise at almost 900K, because we thought that didn't develop until us around 150K. Okay. So Chris Stringer now believes that this may be the ancestral shape of the face, and that prognatic Neanderthal kinds of faces were derived later. Okay. But this was what was amazing about this particular finding and the dating. They eventually do phylogenetic studies and show that, in fact, he's not the ancestor of Homo neanderthalensis in Europe, but in fact is a sideline, sister group to the last common ancestor. So originally they thought maybe he led to Neanderthals, but in fact, he's a side group in the 2000 study, basically, a sister clan. And dental analysis that included Maria also put them as a sister group, basically. Now, was he African to begin with or Asian? All right, that's what Maria is most interested in. All right, was this an African origin species or an Asian origin species? And the reason she raises this whole possibility is that she has basically analyzed the dentition, the teeth of lots of the African fossils and lots of the Asian fossils. And she thinks these are two different groups dentally. And that she thinks that Asia has had more impact on Africa than we used to think, basically, based on her. And that these two kind of developed independently at some point. Okay? So if the population of Eurasian continent was mainly the result of several out of Africa expeditions, we should have found African influences in the skeletal shapes of the Eurasian population. However, the continuity of the Eurasian dental pattern, the top one, suggests that the evolutionary course of the Eurasian and African continents were independent for a long time, and that the impact of Asia and the colonization of Europe was stronger than that of the African influence. So she's talking mainly about this going this way as opposed to necessarily going this way. Okay. At least as I currently understand it, but that there were gene flow going in potentially both directions. So around 1 million years ago, hominids appear to have dispersed into temperate latitudes, not only from Africa, but also Eurasia. And these populations were probably descendants of an ancient out of Africa exodus rather than the later one at the end, the 50,000 one that succeeded. Okay. So we now know that Homo sapiens, African Homo sapiens, left Africa not just at 50,000 and successfully populated the world, but also was popping up as an example in Germany at 200,000, where there's a Neanderthal skeleton that has a femur that has Neanderthal mitochondria. Okay, so we know that they were getting out there, but all of these prior to 50K expeditions died out, just as all of the early Homo sapiens expeditions died out as well. So something was killing them off, basically. Maybe the pathogen types, etc. So With the exception of the major out of Africa expedition based mainly on genetic data, the history of human populations in Eurasia may not have been the result of a few high impact replacement waves of dispersals from Africa, but a much more complex puzzle of dispersal going which way, basically. And she proposes that Asia has played an important role in the colonization of Europe. Okay. She sees similarities in facial, mandibular, and skeletal features, basically, between East and West. So she actually includes Dolly here, the cheekbones being similar to Antecessor, and even Homo erecti and Ulundong, etc. So all these guys grasp at features that they think look similar in some way and therefore raise the question, where do they come from? She postulates in one paper that Africa was the source of a source in Western Asia, and that this source ended up putting populations into Europe and Indonesia and into Europe. So that she thinks the initial colonization of Europe came from this group, which had then some genetic characteristics of Asian populations as well. So a source is the origin of a population. A sink is where these populations end up. Source, sink, sink. Okay. So she thinks there's a kind of more Asian model of colonization of Europe that, although she still thinks, I believe, that the population origin is still Africa, but only before around 2.6 million years ago. After this, she thinks CAD, which is her mono term for the source group. So the central area of dispersals of Eurasia is her title for CAD, and that's that source population that experienced its own evolution when it got there in that area, and then pumped out groups into Europe and Asia, basically. Small groups going out which way? Immigration, population pulses, basically, going out. And she comes up with 9 hypotheses about the colonization of Europe and the East that could be potentially falsified, okay? She thinks you should put out hypotheses that could be disproved, otherwise it's not science. So 1, hominins, including early Homo, left Africa at 1.8 million years ago. So Demonesia as an example. Homo erectus, she thinks, originated in Southeast Asia, which was a central area for the dispersal. That's her CAD group, which includes Homo erectus, okay? 3, hominin dispersals and extinctions in Eurasia during the early Pliocene were primarily driven by climate change. That was both long and short term. Next one, dispersals from CAD into Southern Europe were possible circa 1.7 million years ago. At least one hominin dispersal from CAD into Europe led to the speciation event at 1.2 that resulted in the Cima delle Elefante partial face that we have. Then sub-Saharan Africa was isolated from Eurasia after about 800K because of the desert barrier between Sahara and Arabia. So this Africa gets disconnected from Asia around this period. Next, Homo heidelbergensis is primarily a West Eurasian taxon that is absent from Africa and East Asia. And this may be true, okay? I think Chris Stringer accepts this. The Acheulean biface tools in Europe and possibly India was introduced from Southwest Asia, not Sub-Saharan Africa. So she thinks Homo Erectus moves into the Cad source region in Western Asia, and there develops the Acheulean, as opposed to it being developed in Africa. Although the current data shows that the oldest Acheulean is dated to 1.7 in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, no data that I know shows old European Acheulean of that age. And lastly, after Heidelbergensis dispersed into Europe, it replaced or may have interbred with some remnant populations of Homo antecessor. Those are her 9 hypotheses, basically. And it's her model of evolution in Western Eurasia, basically. But her conclusion is that Africa should not be regarded as the source of either Homo heidelbergensis or European Acheulean. And again, I note that Acheulean first appears at 1.7 in Africa. The earliest European Acheulean dates to around 700K from Africa. Okay, so she's got a ways to proving her theory. So, Cima de Elefante, the oldest European fossil at the time, announced in 2007. It was the mandible from Atapuerca, which is near where Cima de los Huesos is as well. And this is what the mandible at 1.2 million years ago looks like. Some of the teeth. And this is the group that's been working on this Atapuerca site for now 30 years, basically. They're a really dedicated group of nicknamed Pink. Okay, this partial face, a hemi lower face. Okay? And here is that's a twinning CT. A little bit like Homo antecessor, but not quite. Okay? And the possibility is that obviously this is the ancestor of antecessor. So they don't think that ATE 7-1 belongs to antecessor. It's more primitive, and it probably shares more features with Homo erectus than antecessor. So this is a comparison of it with Demonisi, with one of the Homo erecti from Africa, and the Sanjiran Homo erectus from Java. And they named it Homo affinis erectus. Okay, so they because data is not enough to confirm or discard it from being Homo erectus, they gave it a slightly different name. And has not been documented out of Africa before this time. So this is Cima de los Huesos, which is above this is a 50-foot channel that drops into this region. And on the bottom layers is where they found Neanderthal. Above it is a whole bunch of bears. Lots of bears ended up falling into the pit as well. And there are 28 different individual early Neanderthals in this pit. This is Skull 5, which we have at the Academy, and it's the one that they got the DNA at 430K. It's a beautiful skull, has a nice hole on one end that resulted from when it was first dug up, not from the fall. But they have found 6,500 fossils, 29 different individuals. It's among the it is the largest Neanderthal collection in the world. Second is Krapina in Croatia. And as a consequence, they got massive numbers of teeth, which is Torres's specialty, basically. These are 17 of the skulls that they have found so far. And the oldest hominin DNA comes from a femur that they found at Siemens Oasis, and they got nuclear DNA after they first found the mitochondrial DNA. Again, the mitochondrial DNA is Denisovan, and that's another Asian connection, okay, in Europe. One of the reasons why Torres thinks East influenced West. And then they discovered the pinky bone from the Denisova cave, and they published, Strauss did the first publication, the first author in 2010. Huge teeth, Homo erectus-like morphology, they thought at the time. And then they discover in Tibet the Shia mandible. And then within this year, they discovered the Penghu mandible from Taiwan, okay, from the channel here. And these are some of the major fossils from China, as well as the ones from Indonesia. And here's where Denisova is in comparison. It's almost 2,000 miles difference. And also this way, it's almost 6,000 miles. So they got around. Homo erectus definitely has different teeth, and the ones from Zirconian in near Beijing, the Hexian fossil. But these are the fossil teeth of Peking, basically. This, by the way, is called tardontism, where basically you just get kind of one massive root compared to your standard model. And it's a classic characteristic of Neanderthals, right? And they also discovered that at around this level of Homo erectus, this region is called crenulation, sort of up and down, up and down, up and down. It's a wavy-edged enamel dentine junction with stout roots, and taurodontism is unique to Asian Homo erectus. Okay, this is one of the ways you immediately identify that you've got a Asian Homo erecti. Here are examples of taurodontism in Homo erecti. Okay, so it wasn't only the Neanderthals. In fact, Neanderthals may have gotten this from their Homo erecti ancestors. Okay, the body of the tooth is enlarged at the expense of the roots, resulting in a vertically elongated pulp chamber and reduced root length. Okay, it's the description. And so again, without ancient DNA evidence, it's going to be hard to assign who is a Denisovan. And this is the Bei Wu article from 2024, where they separate out the Homo longi group, which includes Harbin, the Maba Ulongon group, and the new Homo juliensis group, with the two big skulls, but they also include all the Denisovan material in it. So this has been, by the new two studies from June 18th, has been pretty much dismantled, in my opinion. You're gonna have to rethink that one. The other question, are there Neanderthal traits in Asia? Okay. Or are we looking at Denisovan traits, which could be potentially similar because of the common ancestry? And Anybody want to give a pronunciation try at this one? Shuji Yao. Okay. The anterior teeth look Neanderthal. The posterior teeth look like Asian Homo erectus. The team tried and failed to access ancient DNA, basically. And Maria was part of this group. And I think this is, maybe it's not him. No, maybe not. But they were looking at these teeth and couldn't get. They've been trying to get ancient DNA for 15 years, basically. And Shu Chang is the other big skull, that's 1600 cc's. Again, you get those two teeth characteristics that are also found here. So in this article by a number of Chinese authors, they raise the question: is this one possibly a Denisovan? Okay, so they've been wondering. Then there's Mamba, who has been historically considered very similar to Neanderthals, and they've been. And remember, what, 2 months ago, they discovered the Laquina lithics in a Chinese area, and those lithics are classically Neanderthal, and it raised the possibility that Neanderthals had gotten all the way to China, not only to Siberia in Denisova, where we also find them. And so it could, or that these are being misidentified as Neanderthals when in fact they're Denisovans who learned the Laquina technique from their ancestors, the Neanderthals, right? All kinds of possibilities here. And Hulindong at 300K, 1000 cc's is different from Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and the Denisovan mandible, and closer a little bit to modern humans. The face looks much flatter, etc. So there's a question there. So now we know that Homo longi, that this phylogenetic branch is actually Denisovan, okay, from the two flu studies. But are there parallels of Africa in Asia? Okay, there are this is the Floresbad skull. This is the Jebel Erhoud, very flat face, but Neanderthal-like posterior cranium, right? Just like Harbin. And are these, in this study, they were questioning, is this Homo daliensis, basically? They thought Harbin may in fact have been more like Dali. Now we've got to find it, now that we know this is Denisovan, whether these two also might be a Denisovan as well. And as I mentioned at the end of this talk by Torres, Johannes Kraus, one of the lead guys at Leipzig these days, made the comment after the talk that we really need to look at these early populations as possibly being lots of them as being hybrids, that the hybridization data of Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens, including the Denisovan mitochondria, Cimadilosuesus, that gene flow between early African and Eurasian Neanderthals was going on. We know that before 270K, because we have DNA in the German femur, that there was gene flow going on all over the place. So there has been less focus on how hybridized Neanderthals were. Some people think it wasn't just 2%, that it could have been. In fact, the early European Homo sapiens had 5 to 10% Neanderthal from their hybridization. Some people think it may have been as high as 60, and the just born hybrid kids were 50-50, okay? So Neanderthal is a product of two lineages meeting about 300,000 years ago, and we need to consider Neanderthal as a weird lineage, is his opinion. Maria responded, well, we seriously need to have way more early Homo sapiens DNA to look at for comparison purposes. Sarah Tiskov, who is the American African specialist, noted in one of her studies that Neanderthals carried genes acquired from earlier modern human interactions, basically. She looked at 12 areas in Africa and found a whole bunch of Neanderthal DNA, and that approximately 6% of the Neanderthal genome was inherited from modern humans. Okay, which means that what we think of as the Neanderthal genome is potentially originally 10% plus modern human. Okay, so these guys really mixed it up in effect. And again, most of the Neanderthal human DNA was in the non-coding regions of Neanderthal genome, indicating that modern human gene variants were being preferentially purified from the coding sections of the genome, which suggested that having modern human genes in the Neanderthal was detrimental to evolutionary fitness. So we know that in both modern humans and Neanderthals who had the early 50-50 split, very quickly within several thousand years got rid of most of the other guy's genes. Okay, so that we ended up with only 2%. Otherwise,
Charlie,
yes.
a question. So you've talked about how, a few percent of the Neanderthal genes are in Denisovans and in modern humans due to crossbreeding. But isn't it possible that those genes are there because after the species split, those genes had an evolutionary advantage, and so they aren't there due to solely crossbreeding. Is that true?
That's clearly a possibility. Yes. The things that last are the things that help you survive. So any genes that you catch from a, quote, different species will only last if it helps you survive. Originally, the thinking was the Neanderthal genes that went into early Homo sapiens in Europe lasted there because they gave modern humans immunity genes from Neanderthals that helped them survive in Europe.
Yeah, there are other cases if they're in haplogroups where their adjacent genes are pulled along with ones that are beneficial. So there can be negative ones attached.
Correct. That's also a possibility. Yes. Okay.
Say, Charlie?
Yes.
There must have been an incredible amount of migrations back in that time. You imagine going all the way from Africa to China and back. It must have been several generations that did these group things, kind of like monarch butterflies.
Well, remember, I think I mentioned earlier that Denel, one of the Asian specialists, has always contended that the savanna in Africa was identical to the savanna in Asia, and that acted as a corridor for leaving Africa starting very early. I mean, we know that Homo erectus did it at 1.8 million years, but back and forth is the other possibility as well. And they've been leaving on a regular basis. Whether they survive, we know was very difficult because they didn't necessarily take over the world earlier.
Charlie?
Yeah.
Can you just tell me briefly why Homo erectus is not considered our last common ancestor?
Well, he is considered.
It is.
The problem is we don't know when he turned into what. Did he turn into us, or did he turn into Heidelbergensis or something else?
Habilis.
We don't have enough data yet.
Okay.
As an example, the I actually sent another email to Dr. Fu saying, what's next? Are you going to go after Dolly or the gold pot would be Homo erectus? Okay, in terms of DNA, if they could possibly get proteins out of him, then we could see how we were connected. But almost everybody believes that erectus was a common ancestor, if not the primary one, of eventually Homo sapiens, either somewhere in Africa or somewhere in Eurasia. That's still not enough data to tell us, basically. Okay, a few more minutes. This is Tom child found in 1924 by Robert Dart in South Africa, given to him by a teenager. And he went to Europe, to Britain, to try to convince everybody that this was one of our origins. It was actually Australopithecus africanus, as opposed
if you're showing your screen, we don't see it.
I see it.
Oh, really? I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah, I saw it.
I'm sorry. Something happened.
Something happened.
Keep going.
Okay. He accidentally left it in Britain in a cab one night. Dart did, when he was showing it around to British paleontologists, and they thought it was a murder suspect. But most of the British guys did not believe him, partially because in 1912, Piltdown had been found with a big brain, and this guy has a 350 brain. Okay, so they thought he was just an ape. Because of that, he wasn't accepted very quickly until Robert Broom started finding lots of Australopiths in South Africa in the 1930s, proving that we originated in Africa. So Tong is really important in terms of the first. But earlier, one of the great defenders of Charles Darwin in Germany was Ernst Haeckel. And he was considered one of the bulldogs for Darwinism. But one of his theories as to where they were going to find us, our ancestors, he thought was Asia. So despite Darwin, who thought because of the apes in Africa that we probably originated there, he said, go east. And this is his famous evolution tree that has received a lot of publication. And this is Homo sapiens up here. Right below it is Homo stupidus. And guess who that was? That was Neanderthal. But he also puts Pithecanthropus alula, which is ape man without speech, and that's Homo erectus in his belief. So Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, and then Homo erectus. So you see direct line of evolution, basically, with the apes going this way, and so the other guy, orangutans, going that way. And because of the different types of fossils, that was why they were thinking this. Pre-1891, these were the only known fossils, basically. These are, this is Neander, 1856. This is 1848, Quarry Gibraltar. This is Angus, Belgium, 1828, okay? But wasn't identified for another 100 years. And this is Cro-Magnon in France. So this was it in terms of fossils. No erecti in Europe had been discovered at this point. The only Homo sapiens was Cro-Magnon in 1868. Okay, so Eugene Dubois discoverer of Homo erectus in Indonesia, 1891. He publishes Pithecanthropus erectus in 1894. He was I always get it wrong, but I think Belgian doctor, studied there and in Britain. And in 1891, he joins the military expedition to Trinidad, Java, and discovers a fossil skull cap that proves transitional man-ape as hypothesized by Haeckel, the missing link. Okay, a bipedal ape that had human-like brain, but retained a few ape characteristics. He names it Pithecanthropus, ape man, who walks erect. The entire British establishment, Arthur Keith, thought it was an ape. And it so angered Dubois that he hid all of his fossils under the floorboards under his dining room for the next 30 years. Okay, he was really pissed off. And they remained hidden until an American paleontologist, I never get the pronunciation right, but Ardlicka in 1922 convinced them to get him out. But it was all contaminated by the Piltdown hoax, where they thought they had discovered a large-brained fossil in Britain. That was the British contribution to science. This was the fake. Well, they still don't know who did it, but an orangutan jaw and a much later human skull. But this was the skull cap that Dubois found, as well as a femur in Trinidad, Java. It had a lesion in it, basically. He also found a tooth, and these were the holotype for Homo erectus in 1891, basically. And it was dated to somewhere around 1 million to 700,000 years ago. And it's the first early human fossil recognized outside of Europe. Here's the skull cap. And it is now no longer buried under the floorboards. It's the Naturalis Biodiversity Center in Leiden, the Netherlands, is where it now lives, basically. Java, along the Solo River, and all of the most famous Homo erectus Java species, Sanjiran, Trinel, Nandong, Mojokerto, are all along this region that were discovered. We'll eventually talk about all of them, but along the Solo River. And in fact, they just discovered a whole bunch of Homo erectus bone from the water region at the end of the Solo River that was underwater for the last 100,000 years, basically, and looked much like the previously discovered material. This is where he found the femur and the skull cap along this river. And there, I think we will end it. All right, so lots of new material this time. Interesting stuff.
Fabulous, Charlie. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Say, Charlie,
yes.
what was last week's? I missed it.
Last week.
A long time ago.
I switched. Oh, we did language.
Yeah.
Language.
Yeah, we did language. And next time, we'll go back to the regular schedule, which is Java in the second week. I mean, Eastern Asia in the second weekend, language in the fourth week.
Can you send a recording of that out?
Yeah.
You did.
You did?
I
Okay,
did.
good.
Yeah,
I probably have it in my files.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thanks for being good listeners.
Thanks a lot. Fabulous.
Catch you next time. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Charlie.
Bye-bye.